20 years ago, from a studio that no longer exists, there came a game that truly stood the test of time. Ensemble Studios brought forth the beginning of a fantastic franchise that allowed us to enjoy ourselves and both learn at the same time about our history, about our shared cultures through Age of Empires. A real-time strategy game that, unlike many of its contemporaries, was not about space aliens, it wasn't about orcs and elves, it wasn't about far, far away planets with deserts and no water, unless you counted the one that was in the sieges. It wasn't about demons and dragons, it was about us. It was about people. It was about how we progressed from the earliest stages of living in caves and bashing each other over the head with clubs to developing culture, art, technology, and stabbing ourselves in the face with ballistas. And it did so with a rhythm that Civilization could not match, because this was a real-time strategy game. One that also had a bit more of a leg up over Civilization in the sense that it was more historically accurate. The comparison between the two is not without merit. Both were designed in some part by Bruce Shelley, who worked at Microprose, who developed Civilization alongside Sid Meier, and then founded Ensemble Studios along with a bunch of other people with the hope of one day creating a video game, a real-time strategy game that would take history to the masses, that would teach people that there's a lot to love about wanting to learn history. Now, the game itself is not historically accurate. It is not a very detailed recounting of events. It is not a superbly, minusculely built recreation of combat throughout the ages. It is, again, as it was with Civilization, the idea of history. But this time it is better done on account of you can't start as the America tribe in the Stone Age fighting against the Babylonians while being led by Abraham Lincoln. You would also not fight using tanks versus spearmen and somehow still lose. You would just have the military might that would be associated with, at best, the Iron Age, though with its expansion you would get into classical antiquity. Age of Empires was structured in a way that is very familiar to us were we to look at any sort of real-time strategy game, though at the time it wasn't a given that this is how they would all look. You had your campaign with many different options. You could play as the Athenians trying to assert their dominance over their fellow Greeks. You could play as the Yamato clan over in Japan. You could play as a bunch of different people through semi-historically accurate events that at least fit the idea. You would build towers, you would build defenses, you would raid farms, you would be tasked with turning a small little tribe into an empire. And these were not what I would call the easiest missions possible, especially in the original version of the game. They did have some challenge to them due to three primary reasons. One was that the AI of the enemy was actually clever. It was designed to be clever, to actually play the game and not cheat. Not saying it never cheated, but it did so less than you would see in most other RTS games of the time. So that meant that it had to know what to build, how to build, and how to attack. The second reason why the campaign may have been a bit hard for newcomers is that by today's standards, the control mechanisms were horrid. You could not do something as simple as double-click to select every unit of a certain type. That may not seem like it's something important, but when you're starting out in the Stone Age, most of your units look the same. You would ideally want to send your warriors somewhere to club people over the head with their clubs, and not your peasants to club people over the head with their clubs on account of they don't have as much life and do a bit less damage, and they honestly should be working. And the third reason why, and this is mostly the reason why the campaign is going to be tough, the game's pathfinding was the worst. It should not be called pathfinding. Pathfinding sort of gives you the general idea that at one point you would actually find a path. It's like the reverse of that Chuck Norris joke where it says that Chuck Norris doesn't go hunting, he goes killing because hunting would imply a chance of failure. Pathfinding would imply a chance of eventually finding a path. This is just getting lost. Your units would get lost in a straight line, they could not handle walking next to each other. In the game they tried to balance things out a bit and compensate for this with things like, for example, if an enemy unit walks past one of yours and your unit starts swinging and the other one is already a couple of meters away, it'll still hit it. There's lag compensation or stupidity compensation built into the game. It also kind of made super fast units kinda not that super duper useful since they could still get hit, because it didn't matter where they were when the animation ended, it mattered if they were there to begin with. But in terms of unit balance, it really didn't matter that much since you could pretty much build ranged units and realize that, oh, the melee ones aren't that good, especially if you have fast range units. If you have mounted range units, or worse ballistas, you could tear through everything. Or you could just cheat and have yourself a car that kills everything, or robots. The cheats in these games were always very fun. But back to the idea at hand, apart from the campaign, you could also play in skirmish mode with many different kinds of matches. You could play until you killed everybody, until you got a certain score, until you built a wonder and kept it for some time. And you had flexibility in it. You could play with a random map. You could just generate a random map on the fly with many different options, place enemies there. You can even edit your own maps and play around with them and just have fun. Enter a map and just lose yourself. There is a thing that few RTS games manage to do, and that is build atmosphere, build a mood, build a sense of belonging. Personally, for me, Dune 2 was able to do it. Stronghold was able to do it, and so did Age of Empires, because it wasn't just a flat plane upon which you fought other people or the AI. It looked alive. You had animals running around, even killing each other if a predator came into contact with prey. You had schools of fish jumping around in the seas and oceans. You had berry bushes that were growing about, waiting to be collected. And honestly, the berry bushes in this game look better than the second one. I'll always maintain that to be an absolute truth. Most of all, you had a map that reflected change. It reflected your impact upon it. You would cut down forests. You would kill game. You would extract resources and they would all be forever gone. Nothing would remain. You would replace the beauty of nature with the strength of humanity. Because although things got a bit grimmer as you sort of turn everything into a wasteland, your settlement, your small little, not even a shack, it was a bunch of bones sticking out of the ground upon which you sort of string together some hammocks or something. That little collection of fossils would evolve. It would become an actual building. It would become something usable, something that looks like it was built by something other than an animal, by an ape. Your petty hovels would turn into houses, your ramshack makeshift barracks would turn into a fort. You would have temples, you would have art, you would have what actually appears to be the product of culture, of a society, of a civilization that is aware of itself, that is not just there to consume, but there to create. Naturally, this wasn't a game where you would achieve a diplomatic victory or one that involved culture in any way. You were still pretty much in the killing department for the most part, but you still had some semblance of it being a bit more like you could trade. You could set up a trade route with the docks of even your opponents, where you're not, destroyed by triremes and war galleys that could be built and would terrorize the seas. And of course, your temples wouldn't actually be the cultural kind. You would use them to produce priests, which would then in turn go wololo and convert the enemy units to your cause. Now, that did cost a lot, so they weren't meant to be overused, and it did have a sort of mana to them. energy that had to regenerate before you could use them again. But still, you could kidnap units. And if you kidnapped the big one, well, the enemy could have probably lost the battle. Not that it would matter that much, since battles in this game usually took place between multiple big units, many of them. You were encouraged to construct as big as an economy as you could, with tens of workers just chopping away at things and ignoring the fact that the game does not make sense at a fundamental level. One thing I always appreciated about this game is that you didn't have just one resource. You didn't have just gold and then everything came from gold. No, you actually had to find food for your people to train new ones that they wouldn't actually eat it over time. That would have made it a bit more difficult, maybe interesting. Who knows? You would have wood needed to construct most of your buildings at first when you relied on wood. You would have stone that you absolutely needed to build towers, to build walls, to build grander structures that cannot be accomplished with wood. And again, you had gold, which you used to buy units, to purchase upgrades, to research things, to develop your society, to go from the Stone Age the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and never actually dig up any tin, any copper, or any goddamn iron. No, really, you didn't, ever. There was no metal. Well, yeah, gold is a metal, but you couldn't actually dig up the metals you would need to make the weapons. That didn't always bother me, but when someone pointed it out, I could not unsee it. I could not unthink it. But there is the excuse that Age of Empires is not trying to be a simulator, it is trying to give you a superficial idea of history. Though again, one that is more grounded in reality than civilization, on account of you never actually playing as the French caveman empire ruled by François Mitterrand or Charles de Gaulle. You'd actually play as the Gaul. Well, no, I don't think he actually had Gauls in the first one. He had him in the second one. You pretty much had everything in the second one. There are quite a few instances where if a game gets a sequel, it is automatically made invalid by it. It is no longer necessary for it to exist. And Age of Empires is close to being one of those games. Now, some of the issues it had did get fixed with the expansion Rise of Rome, where you could actually double-click a unit and thusly select every unit of that type. But it wasn't until the sequel that we actually got functioning pathfinding and unit behavior that wasn't horrible. While the AI, the enemy AI, was good, your units were dumb. They would not act and do anything of their own volition at all, ever. It required a degree of micromanagement that could drive you insane. And yet there is still one thing that this game does which its successor does not. It shows you the beginning. It shows you from where we started. It focuses on those little moments. Before man understood what farming was. You have to go through a whole chain to build just one farm, to be self-sufficient. Otherwise you rely on the environment, on foraging, on hunting, on fishing. Though fishing still is quite useful later on account of the boats having their own thing. They're not tied to the land, to the people, and can only fish. Whereas the sequels, they focused on the ever-expanding and ever-encompassing complexity of war, where you would start from the Roman Age and go to the medieval age, have knights, you have siege engines, cannons, you have arquebuses, you have muskets. Things were simple back then. Not super simple, but they were simpler. You didn't have as many units as in Age of Empires 2. Sure, some of the units would still kind of look alike and you probably still couldn't tell some of them apart at first glance, but when a war elephant comes charging at you, you kind of know it's a war elephant. You could also hunt elephants in the game for food. It was a game more limited in scope, but it was still so fun to play, especially if you built walls all over the place, which I pretty much did not in the video on the background, which is why I never won, even if I cheated. There isn't much reason to play Age of Empires 1 now, unless you want to see how the series began, how it went from the Stone Age to the Roman Age, and then everything was improved with Age of Kings. I penciled this into the schedule initially because there was supposed to be a remastered version of it out now, but Microsoft decided it would be better to delay it into next year, and I'm okay with it as long as the final version of the game is better than the original. It's actually actually kind of funny to see Microsoft being on a Age of Empires kick right now. And they killed a studio. They killed Ensemble Studios. They killed a studio that made hit after hit. They made Age of Empires, which consistently sold millions upon millions of copies. They closed that studio while they were still working on Halo Wars. They didn't even give them a chance to remain functional as a studio depending on the success of Halo Wars. No, they just closed it outright and told everybody they would do 3 months before that game was even done. So there would be no more Age of Empires. The series itself stopped after the third game, where it was mostly about the conquest of the New World and a bit with the Asian dynasties, and it was planned that it would go on into the World Wars and then into the far-flung future, which is a concept that Empire Earth already covered, which is a game that exists because of Age of Empires. A lot of games exist because of Age of Empires, but now Microsoft seems to have discovered the error of its ways, or it's just trying to pretend again like it's trying to do good things for the PC market and then just backstab us again like it always does, and will not just make a remake of 1 and 2, but will also create a brand new Age of Empires 4. What will it be about? We will soon learn. As for the original, you can't get it anywhere on account of the remake was going to be launched right now, so just wait for the remake and hope it will be as good. Better than the original. If not, well, this is not going to be a good start to a rebirth of a franchise. Goodbye.